For this section of the review, we'll be looking at international economic concepts. International economic concepts includes topics such as comparative and absolute advantage and the foreign exchange. The first topic we'll talk about with international economics is absolute advantage and comparative advantage. The idea of absolute advantage is the notion that a country can produce more or outweighs the ability to produce from a absolute advantage essentially says that one country can just flat out produce more than the other country. Comparative advantage, however, compares the two countries and says, look, can you specialize in one good and we specialize in another good and then we trade, therefore producing these at a lower opportunity cost? For instance, we may allow Mexico to produce avocados and tomatoes while we produce Boeing airplanes. Then we just decide let's trade these two products. We'll allow you to do what you do best. We do what we do best. We specialize and trade, and both of us end up better off. So comparative advantage is looking at the production of a good or a service with a lower opportunity cost. The cost of the United States focusing their efforts on tomatoes and avocados may come at too high a cost in ventures such as Boeing airplane. This example of absolute advantage says that the United States is just flat out better than Mexico in terms of their economic production. However, we can allow, again, Mexico to focus on what they do best, we focus on what we do best, and we trade. So there are essentially two methods to solving the math side of these problems. There is an output method and an input method. For the output method, we use a method called the O-Go method, and that is other goes over. So what we're going to do if this problem deals with an output is we are going to take one side of the column and place it over the other side of the column. And what that's going to do is that's going to give us a ratio of one unit of these products to the unit of the other product. In this example, we have the total number of MP3 players produced and the total number of tablet computers produced. Again, making this an output question. For output, I'm going to use other goes over. So I'll take my 2 and place it over my 4 to create a ratio of 2 over 4 or 1/2. Now the question is 1/2 of what? Well, whatever is in this side of the table, for instance MP3 players, we will look at the per unit opportunity cost of the other item within the box. So in this example, one MP3 player is going to cost me a certain amount of tablets. In this particular example, 1/2 of a tablet. We repeat the process on the other side of the table. So I take 4, put it over 2, and that breaks down to 2. To what? 2 MP3 players. Therefore, one tablet costs Mytopia 2 MP3 players. We repeat that process for the bottom portion of the table. Again, other goes over. So 3 goes over 9, 9 goes over 3. Now what I'm looking for is who can do this at a cheaper cost. Sometimes it's helpful to look at these as dollars. So I might say, well, it takes Mytopia $2 to produce a tablet, whereas it takes Yourtopia $3. Well, I want the country to produce what they produce best at a lower opportunity cost. So in this case, it would be better for Mytopia to focus on the production of tablets as it costs them less, so that we specialize on what we do best at a lower cost. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to circle the lower opportunity cost. 2 is less than 3 and 1/3 is less than 1/2. Therefore, Mytopia should focus again on tablet production. Yourtopia focuses on MP3 players. So the first question says, who has the comparative advantage in producing MP3 players? And again, we mentioned Yourtopia should focus on that. Who has the comparative advantage in tablet production? Well, Mytopia can do it at a lower opportunity cost. So then we ask this question, why does trade take place at all? Well, it's all about specialization. If one country can specialize in the product that they do best, another country can specialize on the product they do best, and then these two countries trade, then everyone is better off in the end. Here's an example of what we call an input question. For input, I want to use the method known as IOU. Input, other goes under, not over. So this question is an input question because it is referring to the number of labor hours necessary to produce one unit of this product, in this case an iPhone or an iPad. Again, labor hours make this an input question. Now it could be that they were saying the total number of workers, the total number of machines, the total amount of acreage. One way or the other, to make this an input question, it has to represent an input for production or a factor of production. To solve this problem, we're going to take numbers from one column and place them underneath the numbers from the other column. So for example, we would put the 10 under the 20, the 10 becoming my denominator, and then we just reduce down. And in this case, for this country, Jasmine, to produce one iPhone is going to cost her the opportunity to produce two iPads. That for Jasmine, one iPad would cost her a half of an iPhone. Repeat that process for Laura, and we can see her opportunity cost as well. So the question becomes, again, who has the comparative advantage? Again, I'm looking for who can do it with less opportunity cost. So for Jasmine, it only costs her two iPads compared to Laura's three. Or for Laura, it only costs her a third of an iPhone compared to Jasmine's half. Therefore, the individuals that can produce these products with the lowest opportunity cost should focus on what they do best. Notice this question asks us about absolute advantage. Remember, the absolute advantage says that one country or person can produce more than the other country. Well, in this example, we're talking about hours. So Laura can produce faster than Jasmine in producing both iPhones and iPads. That is absolute advantage. However, comparative advantage says that one person can produce at a lower opportunity cost than the other person. For this example, Jasmine can produce at a lower opportunity cost than Laura. Laura should focus on the production of iPads as it only costs her a third, or 0.33 of an iPhone. So comparative advantage is a way for us to look at who should produce what with a lower opportunity cost. For this problem, we will be looking at two countries and their production of two products. As we solve this problem, we'll look at the comparative advantage between these two countries, the terms of trade as they choose to trade one good for another, and as they specialize in producing one product, how they gain from trade. So let's start off by looking at the comparative advantage between these two countries. The first step in solving this problem is to determine whether this is an output or an input question. As you can see here, the number represented in the table is the total number of steel, or the total number of televisions that these two nations produce. Therefore, this is what we call an output question. For an output question, we are going to take numbers from one column and place them over numbers from another column. We refer to this as the other goes over method. So for example, I will take my 3 and put it over the 6. Over here, I'll take the 6 and put it over the 3. 2 over 8 and 8 over 2. And effectively what this is going to help us do is to determine what we call the per unit opportunity cost. As each of these nations produce one steel or one TV, within the table will represent the opportunity cost of production. So the next thing I need to do is to reduce down all of these fractions. 3 over 6 can be reduced down to 1/2. And what this represents is the opportunity cost in production of steel. So one steel for Japan costs them a half of a TV. Over here, one TV costs Japan 2 steel. Likewise, for South Korea, when they focus on steel production, their cost is 1/4 of a TV. And for South Korea, one TV costs them 4 steel. Now, I'm going to take this information and I'm going to plug it down here so it's easy to refer to. Again, for Japan, one steel costs them a half of a TV. One TV costs them 2 steel. For South Korea, one steel costs them 1/4 of a TV, and one TV costs them 4 steel. So, South Korea has a comparative advantage in the production of steel as the cost of TVs is less for them. Japan here has a comparative advantage in the production of televisions. We always want the country to produce the product for which they have less opportunity cost. Sometimes I recommend changing these to dollars. So instead of looking at this as 2 steel, I look at it as $2 and this as $4. And again, we're looking at who can do it with less cost. Over here again, we would have 25 cents versus 50 cents. Who can do it with less cost? Now, a little trick that I like to use is to put these numbers on what I call a per unit opportunity cost PPF. So I'll take and bullet point one TV on the y-axis, and on the x-axis will be the cost. So one TV will cost Japan 2 steel. One TV will cost South Korea 4 steel. Now the rule of thumb here is that trade must occur between these two opportunity costs for this to make sense. So because we have a nice clean number of 2 and 4 as our opportunity cost, we'll take and use 3 as the term of trade. In other words, one TV must be traded for something in between 2 and 4. In this case, we'll take 3 steel. Now, it could have been 2.25 steel or 3.75 steel, but 3 falls in between the two, so it makes it nice and clean. The logic behind this is that Japan, when they focus on producing televisions and trade one, must gain profit. In their own country, when they take one TV and sacrifice it to make steel, they can make 2 steel. So in the trade, they have to receive more than they could have received on their own in their own country. Therefore, they must receive more than 2. For South Korea, when they focus on steel production and they want a TV in their own country, it costs them 4 steel. So for them, this has to be a less costly endeavor. Therefore, they have to give up less than 4. So again, for Japan, they have to get more than 2. South Korea must give up less than 4. This is known as the terms of trade. Now, the way that we can analyze the gains from trade is by looking at the total PPF for these countries in the production of steel and televisions. For this, I'll select Japan. When they produce all steel, they can produce 6 total steel or 3 total televisions, or somewhere in between. Now, in this example, Japan is going to produce all televisions because that's what they have a comparative advantage in, and they will export one of those televisions for 3 units of steel. Now, on their own, if Japan would have given up this 1 unit of television, along their PPF, they would have been right about here. So what that means is that with their own production domestically, to give up that 1 television, they would have been capable of producing 2 steel. Well, now, as they trade, and based on the terms of trade, they are now trading 1 television for 3 steel. So this point indicates a scenario before trade, whereas this bullet point represents a scenario after trade. For Japan, their ability to trade 1 television for 3 steel puts them outside their PPF. Subsequently, this nets them a result of an additional steel that before trade they were incapable of producing. So the gains from trade here for Japan are 1 additional steel that they could not have done on their own. Now let's go through a couple of basic terms. For international economics, we should know what exports and imports are, the balance of trade, and what net exports represents. Additionally, the balance of trade will tell us whether we have a trade deficit or a trade surplus. So let's start with exports. So if the United States sells Boeing airplanes to another country, that is an export. An import is something we purchase from another country. So if the United States buys bananas from Honduras, that is an import. The balance of exports and imports, or exports minus imports, gives us the balance of trade, i.e. net exports. If you buy more than you sell or import more than you export, then you end up with what is called a trade deficit. The United States has had a trade deficit for the better part of 30 years. A trade surplus is when we sell more than we buy. So the Chinese, particularly with the United States, are running trade surpluses. And again, the balance of trade is determined by the balance of exports and imports. If exports are equal to imports, then trade is balanced. Sometimes countries make it more difficult to trade with each other, and sometimes they make it easier to trade with each other. The next 6 examples will be barriers to trade, things that make it difficult to trade. A trade barrier is a policy that restricts trade between countries. The reason why you would want to restrict trade is to protect domestic production. One way to do that is by establishing tariffs. A tariff is a tax on an imported good. If a tariff is established, it makes the imported good more expensive, thus making the domestic product somewhat more desirable. Sometimes countries put limits on the amount of imported goods or exported goods allowed into the country or out of the country. One such quota that comes to my mind is the quota on sugar, which causes sugar to be slightly more expensive on average for the individual in the United States. An embargo is an outright barrier to trade with another country, a complete barrier to trade. The United States especially has what are called safety standards on imported goods. The Chinese cannot sell us toys that are painted with lead-based paint. Finally, subsidies. Subsidies are when the government pays to a domestic company to help them compete with foreign companies. Now, what are the costs of trade barriers and the benefit of trade barriers? If the United States implements tariffs, quotas, or an embargo, that is going to restrict trade between countries. That's going to lead to the higher price of products and less of a variety of products for the domestic country, in this case the United States. The benefit of trade barriers, for instance like a tariff or a quota or embargo, is that it protects domestic production. So we are able to protect domestic companies at the expense of foreign companies. Again, the cost of a trade barrier is that it's going to make it more expensive, limit the amount of goods from other countries, and restrict variety. The benefit is that it will provide a protection for domestic producers or domestic suppliers. One way to make it easier to trade is to establish a trading bloc. There are three classic examples of these trade agreements in the world today. One is the European Union. The European Union includes around 28 countries in Europe which can freely trade through the use of the euro. Another example is the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, that exists between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and eliminates tariffs and any barrier to trade. Finally, the ASEAN, or the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, represents a trading bloc or agreement with the intent purposes of competing with China. So the purpose of a trading bloc is to reduce trade barriers to make it easier for members to trade and allow trade to exist between the members of the trade bloc. So free trade advocates would say that free trade makes everyone better, and in this case, the trading bloc is able to trade more freely. So to summarize, free trade and the arguments for free trade are such that when you have free trade, this allows for more competition, which leads to lower prices and variety of products. There are arguments against free trade, however, and that's what we will look at with these 5 on the right column. So if you have an American company that is trying to be competitive globally, they may need to first become competitive domestically, and they may need time to become competitive domestically. Restrictions to trade may allot them that time. The second argument against free trade is that open trade with other countries allows them access to our technology. It's possible that some other countries can reverse engineer our products and steal our technology. So this is an argument against free trade in the sense that it would protect our national security. A third argument against free trade is that when we have barriers to trade, American laborers benefit in the sense that they don't have to compete with the global market. So a barrier to trade may actually benefit domestic workers as we keep jobs here in the United States and do not allow them to be outsourced. A common argument that is made against free trade oftentimes is that it allows large multinational companies to exploit workers in other countries for cheap labor. The argument against that, of course, is that if those companies were not in those countries, then they would not have any opportunities or options at all. Finally, there are standards for production in the United States that are regulated by the government and determined based on environment, health, and safety of the citizens. And some of those things may not exist in other countries that have lower environmental standards, that do not regulate their markets as much. So again, there are arguments both for free trade and against free trade. What's important to remember is that each country sort of determines this based on their scarce resources and how they perceive the global economy as a whole. So the last topic that I would like to discuss for international economics are exchange rates. An exchange rate is essentially the price of one currency and the value of another currency. So for instance, with my $1, how many euros can I purchase? With €1, how many dollars can I purchase? In this example, we have $1 being equal to 0.72 euro. So all things remaining the same, the dollar is weaker than the euro because it cannot buy one full unit of a euro. When a currency appreciates, what that means is that the value of that currency becomes stronger relative to another currency. For example, let's say that today $1 can purchase 1 euro. The exchange rate of these two currencies is equal. But then tomorrow I wake up and I read in the news or I go online and Google exchange rates and I see that $1 can now buy 1.5 euro. Well, from yesterday to today, the dollar increased in value. I can now buy more euros than I could buy the previous day. Currencies can also depreciate, which means they can get weaker relative to the value of another currency. Again, for instance, let's say that my dollar can buy 1.5 euro. Tomorrow, my dollar goes back to buying only 1 euro. I can buy less than I could the previous day. So exchange rates do fluctuate, and the values of currencies fluctuate. This will impact our ability to purchase and the net exports of international and domestic countries. So here we have two examples. In this example, we have a scenario where $1, 2 euros, and then that exchange rate changes where $1 is equal to now 3 euro. So from the first exchange rate to the second exchange rate, we can purchase an additional euro that we could not before. That means that our currency appreciated or it increased in its value. So in this example, we have an appreciation of the dollar. What that means is that we will import more from them. When we import more from them, that means that we are exporting less to them. And what that means for the United States is that net exports will fall. When we balance out exports and imports, we will move towards a deficit. So who benefits and who loses from this exchange rate change? Well, there's a couple different ways to look at this. One, the U.S. buyers would benefit because their dollar becomes stronger. That allows them to buy more European products. However, if our dollar is becoming stronger, the euro is becoming weaker, that means that Europeans are going to buy less of our stuff. So American exporters would lose out. In a similar manner, European exporters would win as their net exports would increase as U.S. consumers are able to buy more European products, but they would not be able to buy as much of our products. So again, look at that in two different ways from the perspective of U.S. buyers and exporters and European exporters and buyers. In our next example, we have the international value of the U.S. dollar depreciating when compared to the Japanese yen. So what is going to happen here? If our currency is getting weaker and the yen is getting stronger, that means that we can buy less of their stuff, while simultaneously the Japanese can buy more of our stuff. So the impact on exports is that the U.S. exports will see an increase as Japanese yen becomes stronger. Simultaneously, we will be able to buy less of their stuff, so our imports will fall from Japan. When we balance out the imports and exports, if our exports are rising and our imports are falling, that means that our net exports will also see a rise, or we will move towards a trade surplus. Now, again, who benefits or loses from this? Well, U.S. exporters will win, while importers will lose. We can sell more stuff because the yen is stronger, but we can buy less stuff from the Japanese. Japanese importers win as their yen becomes stronger, but the exporters lose as the dollar becomes weaker and can buy less Japanese products. So this is a summary of international economics and the things that you need to know for this overall unit.